Thank you very, very much for having me. It is a huge pleasure to visit ethical societies around the country, and particularly this one, which is the furthest away one from St. Louis, I think. Or perhaps there's one in Costa Rica, I think, that keeps inviting me to go out, and they do platform addresses on the sand of the beaches. So apart from that one, you are the furthest away one. So my first visit here, it has been a wonderful trip so far, and I'm very, very grateful that you brought me out. Thank you to John and to the board for the invitation. And thank you, Chris, for those opening words. You'll hear resonances of those in what I'm about to say. And congratulations to Jan on your new membership. Everyone should join an ethical society. It is my belief that if we had millions more members of ethical societies, the country and the world will be in a lot better shape than it is today. So I recommend membership to you too. On the night of October 6th, 1998, Matthew Shepard, a 21-year-old gay man, a student at the University of Wyoming, just over 5 feet tall, skinny at 100 pounds with winsome floppy hair, accepted a ride home from a bar in Laramie, Wyoming with 2 men who had pretended to be gay. Those men did not drive Matthew home. Instead, they drove him to a wide open Wyoming countryside, took his shoes and his wallet, tied him to a fence by his hands, beat him brutally around the face with the butt of a pistol while he begged for his life, and left him to die. But Matthew didn't die there. He died 6 days later in hospital, having never emerged from a coma, which means he spent the night after the attack alone, helpless, as his life's blood and his time ran out. Matthew's murder sparked protests around the world. There were rallies on the steps of the Capitol, candlelit vigils in faraway cities. In Laramie, too, the LGBTQ community sprung into action, motivated by outrage, anger, and fear. They mobilized to join the university's homecoming parade with a protest of their own. Beth Lafrida, in her book about Matthew's death, describes their protest the day after the murderers had been charged with the crime. And she wrote this: "As the parade kicked off, 100 students, university employees and townspeople lined up at the end of the long string of floats and marching bands. They had quietly gathered in the morning chill to protest the attack on Matt." Lafrida reports that the response of the town surprised the protesters. While they expected apathy or perhaps hostility, soon people moved to join them, and she continues her description. As the march moved west down Iverson Avenue, spectators began to join, walking off sidewalks into the street. By the time the march reached downtown, it had swelled, and final estimates ranged from 500 to 800 participants. It didn't seem like much, just a bunch of people quietly walking. But it was a genuinely spontaneous, grassroots effort to protest the attack and express the community's profound dismay, and in that sense, it was unforgettable. Yet there were counter-protests as well. In Colorado State University's homecoming parade, a float carried a scarecrow adorned with anti-gay slurs, a reference to Matthew's scrawny, comatose body tied to that fence. And as Matthew's family, friends, and community prepared to mourn his loss, anti-gay hate group Westboro Baptist Church picketed his funeral, and later the trials of both murderers. It was in response to the Westboro Baptist Church that one of the most powerful protests related to Matthew Shepard was created. Romaine Patterson, a friend of Matthew's, organized a group of people to wear white robes, halos, and large angel wings to stand between the Westboro Baptist Church's picket line and Matthew Shepard's family. And this video that I'm about to show you is a short clip from a film which shows that protest.
people out there saying a lot of really horrible things about Matthew, and you're going to want to respond, but remember, there's a big difference between what people say and what things are. So earplugs in, and keep smiling. Remember, you're Matthew's angels.
Mr. Shepard, the prosecutor informs me of your desire to address the jury.
Oh, it gives me chills. It's powerful, isn't it? Now, when Matthew died, I was 15, a skinny, floppy-haired, closeted gay boy in an all-boys school in London. And I remember hearing the news stories and feeling afraid. But I remember, too, seeing the protests, people from all over the world expressing their anger and outrage and solidarity, and feeling hope. I remember thinking that if in some sense I was a person like Matthew, then all those protesters were out on the streets in support of people like me. And that made me feel powerful and supported, despite my fear. And that is what protest is about. Protest is a public expression of values, an insistence that something isn't right, that something needs to change. Protests pose a question to society. Why do things have to be this way? Ultimately, the goal of a protest is not to make a lot of noise or to get on the news or to annoy people. The point of protest is to get others to join you in questioning society, so together you can change it. I tell the story of Matthew Shepard this morning not to make us all sad, although it does make me sad. It is very hard to give this presentation because of how much the story still overwhelms me. But I tell it because Matthew's story and the story of how people responded to that terrible atrocity teaches us a lot about protest as a form of public questioning. It teaches us, to begin with, the importance of solidarity. Often when we protest, the point is to get a lot of people together in one place to demonstrate that a particular cause has mass support and cannot be ignored. When the students of the University of Wyoming gathered to march in their homecoming parade, this was the sort of protest they were doing. They were saying, we see what happened to Matthew. We understand what it was about. We are angry about it. We will not let this pass. It was a successful protest because it drew more people in. The initial crowd of 100 growing by more than 5 times by the end. People stepping off the sidewalk to join them. And imagine how empowering that must have felt to see people literally standing on the sidelines, stepping out into the road to stand beside you instead. I felt that myself in protests I've been involved in. I remember participating in one gay rights march where we were asking people from the crowd to join us, literally taking them by the hands and saying, come march with us. And every time someone would take that step from the sidewalk into the street, small in terms of distance, but huge in terms of psychology, I felt my heart soar. And perhaps some of you have felt it. During one of the Black Lives Matter vigils that we hold every month at the Ethical Society of St. Louis, a family heard about our protest on Twitter and drove to the society and got out of their cars and picked up signs and stood with us. And that was so fantastic. That's solidarity. I felt solidarity a lot too over the past 3 years as I've stood with hundreds of people marching for Mike Brown and against police brutality and violence. In fact, I took this photo at the first National March in Ferguson. and the mass of humanity stretched as far as I could see. That's solidarity. Solidarity is an amazing feeling, and I hope those protesters in Laramie felt a little of it back then. Solidarity shows that we are not trapped alone in our private grief or fear or rage, that we're not the only ones asking why does it have to be this way, but that we have the support of a community behind us. And it's when we have the support of a community and can show others we have the support of a community that we can change things. That's one of the main things rallies and marches do for us. But protest can be so much more than rallies and marches. The standard image that many of us have of protesting, of hundreds of people holding signs and shouting, is certainly a useful type of protest, but it's not the only one. Think of those angels standing between the Westboro Baptist Church and Matthew's family. They didn't hold any signs, they didn't sing any chants, but they were protesting nonetheless. Their dress, the white robes, wings, and halos, made a powerful statement. They symbolized care and purity and love. Their dignified silence, in contrast with the angry yells of the Westboro Baptist Church, also made a statement. They would not be dragged into enraged debate about the merits of homosexuality. They would not dignify hatred with a response. Rather, they stood composed and silent, watching witnesses to the scene. Their huge wings, of course, had a practical purpose. They literally shielded the church protesters from sight and provided a physical barrier between their bile and the family's grief. That's represented beautifully in the clip from the film, I think, as the hateful yells diminish into silence as the angels take their places. And don't forget their smiles. Romaine Patterson, who organised the angels, encouraged them always to smile. What Matthew's angels did there, and what Angel Action, which is the group that was formed after that protest, have done all around the country since then, was offer a different sort of emotional response to a community crisis than the stereotypical image of protesters, loud and raucous. As she wrote in a press release accompanying the first Angel Action protest, so often we find that people are willing to make a lot of noise about what they believe to be true. We don't believe that we have to say anything at all. Our actions will speak for themselves. Our focus is to bring forth a message of peace and love. Hatred is running rampant through our everyday lives, but as a group, we choose to lift ourselves above that hatred. Marshall Gans, a lifelong activist and teacher at the Harvard Kennedy School, who's someone I taught with while I was there, someone I'm privileged to call a mentor, has written a lot about protests, and he believes that an effective protest is not just an automatic reaction to something that's happened, but rather it is a response informed by our values, an action designed to tell a specific story in response to a particular emotional challenge faced by a community. A good protest will recognize the feelings in a particular community which are inhibiting action, feelings of apathy or fear or helplessness or isolation, and speak to those emotions in a way that leads people to act. And that's what Matthew's angels were. In the face of loud, hateful protests against Matthew, they offered a silent, graceful counter-protest in support of him, which mobilized a whole different set of emotions and enabled a response rather than just a reaction. Matthew's angels point to another important aspect of protesting too, which is it can be artful. I think the stereotype of the protester with the hastily scribbled slogan sign and the megaphone undercuts the extent to which protest can be an art form, a beautiful expression of our desire for love and justice. The aesthetics of the angels were an important part of the effect they had, and very often the most powerful protests have an artful quality to them. Gandhi's Salt March is an exquisite example of protest as an art form. In the early 20th century, while India was under British occupation, it was illegal for the people of India to make or sell salt. Salt, a basic necessity, was heavily taxed by the British, who held a monopoly on its production and sale. And to protest this unfair monopoly, Gandhi led a group of activists down to the Arabian Sea, where they sat in the sand and made salt, breaking British law in a wholly non-violent way and bringing worldwide attention to the oppression of the Indian people. And the images of people in robes collecting water from the sea and making salt with their hands, and then being arrested and beaten for such a simple act, galvanized the world to support Gandhi's cause. A single artful action raised the question, why can we not make salt? And sparked a revolution. The legacy of artful protests like these live on in the efforts of the Black Lives Matter protests, which have been working in St. Louis over the past few years. The best example I can think of is a protest in Powell Hall at a concert of the St. Louis Symphony, in which a group stood and sang for justice. And that's an image from that protest. Before the second half of the program began, just before they were about to start playing Brahms' Requiem, the participants stood to sing and unfurled banners affirming that racism lives in St. Louis. The protest combined elements of a flash mob with a traditional protest song, Which Side Are You On?, to create a haunting reminder of the nature of the moral choice which confronts St. Louisans and the whole of the USA at this time. Step out into the street and confront racism, or stand on the sidewalk and support it. Everything about this protest was smart. The song was well chosen and related to past struggles for racial justice. The hand-painted banners make clear statements related to the central issue. The protest was timed in the interval so as not to disrupt the performance. The action was titled Requiem for Mike Brown, which links directly to the occasion for the protest, a performance of Brahms' Requiem. The choice of song as the medium for protest matches the venue, using the symbolic power of the symphony hall to support the action. For what do you do in a symphony hall but listen to music? The protest had a simplicity and an aesthetic sensibility which recalls Gandhi's Salt March. And like the Salt March, it raised a simple question: which side are you on? It was described in Salon magazine as breathtaking. And it was also very effective. It was covered in the press throughout the United States and through pieces on high-profile websites throughout the world. And the skill of the protesters to ask their question in a provocative but inviting way also shines through in the reaction of the symphony audience. It's clear from a video of the protest that you can still watch on YouTube that many in the audience supported the protesters, some rising to their feet to applaud, which has not been the common experience of protesters in St. Louis about this issue, I promise. A less artful protest would have been more polarizing than that. I have had my own experience of the artfulness of protest, one which links back to Matthew Shepard's story. In the summer of 2012, I found myself in Denver, Colorado, for a huge festival of gay and lesbian choruses from all over the world as a member of the Boston Gay Men's Chorus. It's actually the coolest thing you can possibly imagine. It's like 400 plus singers from all over the world. We just sing for each other for a whole week. It's amazing. And after the festival, I had the opportunity to travel with the San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus to Laramie, Wyoming, where Matthew Shepard was murdered. And they were performing a concert for the Matthew Shepard Foundation. And I remember the journey there from Denver. And there's only one word which describes what it felt like to drive for hours in large, packed buses, a strange electricity in the air. to the site of such an atrocity. It was a pilgrimage. It was a journey to a place where something terrible had been done to someone like us because they were someone like us. And as I sat in the audience watching the San Francisco chorus sing, I had the sense that I was witnessing something almost religious, an exorcism of sorts, as my gay family used music to raise and soothe the spirits of those in attendance. It was awesome in the full, unadulterated sense of that word. I felt connected to Matthew, deeply connected, to someone that I had never met, would never meet, but somehow felt I knew. Their music that day was a form of protest, and it was powerful. Protests can be very, very powerful. As I said at the opening of my talk, Matthew Shepard's brutal torture and murder spurred worldwide outrage, and in 2009, after years of vigils and marches and rallies and many lines of angels standing silently to witness, President Obama signed into law the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, expanding US federal hate crime law to include crimes motivated by a victim's actual or perceived gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. All those protests made a difference. And the protests that I've been living through in St. Louis and that we've been living through across America over the past few years on the topic of racial justice have made a difference too. It is so easy to dismiss the actions of protesters by suggesting that they're motivated by the desire to make trouble or to destroy property or just to have fun, as if marching around the streets late at night, dodging cars and rubber bullets and tear gas is fun. Protests can be fun, but that is not. Countless times during my participation in the Black Lives Matter protests, I've been asked, but what difference does it make? And so here's one difference that it has made. Now, all across the country, whenever a person of colour is killed by the police, people take to the streets. And that didn't happen before. Most of the unarmed people of colour killed by police were anonymous, nameless, until the movement that we have created through protesting changed that. Now people are going to know the names of Michael Brown and Antonio Martin and Eric Garner. And this movement did that by repeatedly posing the question, why are so many black people shot by police on the streets, in symphony halls, at ball games, in communities like this one? It's already shifted the register of public debate about race. Those protests made police violence against people of colour an issue in the presidential campaign, something which candidates for president had to talk about. Protesters, including, I'm proud to say, some members of the Ethical Society of St. Louis, helped make that happen. And that's why I believe that protests are a hopeful thing, a joyous thing, something to celebrate. And that's the last thing I want to say about protest today. Protest is not something which other people do. The impulse which births all protest, a sense of injustice, hurt, that something is wrong, is one which we all sometimes feel. And all of us, if we are pushed far enough, will step from the sidewalk into the streets. Protesters are not other people, they are us. And all of us have the power to protest. Protesting doesn't require any special skills or resources. You don't have to be an eloquent speaker or a loud, angry person, or to have artistic talent or lots of money or time or be able to sing or even attend the rehearsals to protest. All you need is passion about a cause and the willingness to share that passion with other people. And we all have that. And because protest is something we can all do, and because it has the power to change things for the better, then we should all do it. It is our responsibility. Protesting is one of the most direct ways we can do something, about the injustices of this world. To be a protester is nothing more or less than to ask our society to be better. We can all do that. We should all be protesters. Thank you very much.
Wow.
Oh, I was going to take questions. I'm sorry.
Yes. So James
I was
has
just like, I'm done.
agreed to. You really did quite enough. But I asked him earlier, would you, James, be willing to take questions? And,
I would.
And have a little bit, maybe 10 minutes of
But I'm going to
discussion.
sit on this thing.
Yes, make yourself comfortable.
Okay.
And, any questions for James?
Yes, Valerie?
Yes.
How do you know my name? I've done that before.
I have kind of two questions. One is about the role of art in all of this. And I think just on a personal level, I'm just curious to hear your opinion whether the work of artists, like on an individual level, maybe if he or she like doesn't necessarily like take it to the street, so to say, and if like his or her work doesn't have an explicitly, shall I say, political or societal content, and it's basically just focused on, let's say, like core human values,
Yeah.
you know, and like, do you think it's still as relevant as some of these other examples you showed to us in a broader sense of the word? And second is, how about, and I know it's a very individual kind of choice, but again, I'm just interested in your opinion, is like when choices we make and sort of values we decide to live by, and like some of these causes we may decide to join, they're like in direct conflict with our families, like with people who like closest to us, and as you know, in extreme cases, and it might even like endanger their lives, and that's kind of not the choice they make, you know, it's the choice you make. So like what do you think about this, you know, making these choices in the face of, you know, potentially hurting, you know, other people? And that's kind of also very often considered like very important human value, right? To protect your family, you know, to to be part of it, and you know, things like that. So what are your views on this kind of conflict?
I'm going to come back to that second question. I'll ask you a little bit more to clarify with an example. But to your first question, I think that many social justice issues are ultimately going to be resolved through shifts in culture rather than through changes in laws. And that often laws follow culture, not the other way around. And artists and storytellers are the people who make culture. And so I think that even if an artist's work does not have explicitly political content, but is merely is focused on the propagation of values, that is actually the most important thing. I think that very often protesters are a little too focused on the promotion of particular social remedies instead of developing a social climate and a set of cultural values which would lead those legal changes to be unnecessary. If I had a choice between a world like today where we have hate crimes legislation and a world in which no hate crimes legislation exists, but there was no hatred towards the people protected by that legislation, I would choose the second one in a heartbeat, right? And so the challenge is actually to change culture. And that means changing the way people think about themselves and their relationships with other people. That's why I am an ethical culture leader, because I want to engage in conversations like this about what sort of society do we want to live in and how should we treat each other. And if we can convince people to treat each other better, we don't need the legal framework to stop them being terrible. So I think artists are incredibly important. Just this past weekend in St. Louis, I gave a talk on the ethics of Star Trek. And it came to mind because Star Trek is an example of a cultural product that propagates humanist values, right? Each little episode is a parable, very, very scriptural. Each one presents a little moral message about how we should treat each other. And really the only difference between the parables of Star Trek and the parables in the Bible or other religious texts is that the Star Trek ones are better. They promote more humane, more rational values than you'll find in any traditional religious scripture. We need more of that. One of the terrible failings of the humanist movement is a reluctance to engage in cultural creation. And like, there are hardly any books which tell stories from a humanist values perspective. If you look at something like Harry Potter, right, there is a whole non-profit organization based on activism, based on the values promoted in Harry Potter, called the Harry Potter Alliance, right? It uses the stories and characters of those books to do activism. So, for example, they challenge companies that give their employees low wages by talking about the plight of the house elves. And they call Walmart Voldemort or something. It's very good. So, but that shows that there is a hunger for cultural products that express progressive values. Conservatives are quite good at creating those. We have traditionally not been so good at harnessing them. So I think it's very important. Okay, you had another question, and I just warn everyone, I answer questions at enormous length. So if you want to ask a question, really ask it immediately, because you won't get the opportunity. Your question, can you give an example of where you see that sort of conflict playing out, so I know exactly what you're asking, because I don't want to answer the wrong question.
I mean, it may sound very simplistic, but for example, my mother and certain people in my family deeply racist, deeply homophobic, deeply this and that, deeply patriotic, but honestly, for me sometimes even not is worse, but at least as bad, because for me, patriotic, person very often, just willingly shuts off, his or her, critical thinking, sort of, but anyway, and it's we don't speak anymore, and it's is it I'm failing to, convert person right next to me into, what I mean, and kind of I'm hurting this person, right? So, and I'm kind of trying to maintain my other values, I'm stepping on some other values, and how do you balance it? How do you balance this out? Or even for example, if I decide tomorrow, to pursue, for example, other career that is going to be much more consistent with my values, but I won't be able to support her financially anymore.
Yeah.
And I know it's a very individual choice. It's not only I can take responsibility for these choices, but I'm kind of interested what kind of mental framework you can use to navigate this sort of questions.
So I think you framed the question very well. I think our greatest ethical challenges are not ones where it's a decision between right and wrong, but it's a decision between different rights, right? When we're weighing up different things, all of which we think to be good, and we're trying to prioritize between them. And so in the example of dealing with relatives, friends, close acquaintances who hold views, right, which you consider to be not just wrong, but immoral, right? That can be very difficult because you want to prize the relationship, you want to show that you respect them and you treat them with dignity that every human being deserves, but you may also believe that their views do not dignify other people. And so how do you do that? Get back to me when you have an answer to that question. I'd really like to know. No, I think that one thing that we can say is, and this is something very peculiarly American that I did not experience so much when I was in England. The idea that disagreeing with someone means that you are mean to them. That is just not true. You can say to someone that I think your politics are appalling, and I think that they really lead to terribly harmful social outcomes, but I love you, and I want to be in relationship with you. That is a totally consistent position. And I really fear for a culture that tells people that disagreement is inherently demeaning. It is not. We have this problem sometimes within ethical societies, when we have disagreements over certain political positions, and people say, well, if you make this stance from the platform, you're insulting or demeaning everyone who has a different view. And it's no. And just arguing that they're wrong. And then there's nothing more human than being wrong, right? So it's not dehumanizing to think that someone is wrong in their political or ethical views. And honestly, that is what ethical discourse is about. It's about right and wrong. So there's a difference, in my mind, between making a judgment that someone has a bad perspective on something and being judgmental towards that person. Those two things are not the same. So I think we need to just stand firm and hold to our values and try and treat people with dignity while being clear what we think about their views.
Thank you.
Of course,
Like
yes.
Lawrence has a question in the back, and I see
Thank you
another
for
hand.
moderating,
Maybe
because I'm
if the rate we're going, maybe those three will be enough.
I'm sorry, everyone.
No,
No, it's wonderful.
That's great
Yes.
stuff.
From our point of view, looking at St. Louis, it seems like that's a reactionary hell of some kind back there. And yet you have this huge amount of people coming to ethical culture. Well, out here we're looking at ourselves as being really left-wing, the good people out here. We can't get anybody to come to our meetings.
Well, wait a minute.
I mean, compared to what you have, you got to talk about that.
Well, I think firstly, we can put it in context. Congregational organizations are all shrinking, right? And it's extremely difficult to get anyone together to any civic activity. The question you ask is being asked by churches of all denominations and congregations of all religious groups all across the developed world, right? So to be able to get this many people in a room on a Sunday morning to talk about a topic like this is a significant achievement. So you should be proud of that to begin with. Well done. Yes, yay you. Now, I actually think, because people ask this question a lot of the time, like how can St. Louis be the biggest society given the politics of that area? I think the politics of that area actually helps us, unusually. Yeah. People feel the need to come together with like-minded people more when they're in a minority than when everyone else thinks like them. And so I think that that's part of it. It's also part of the country that still has a bit of an ethos of people asking, which church do you go to? There is a slight social pressure, not so much as in the Deep South, but there is a slight social pressure towards congregational membership in general, which makes people think, oh, maybe I should find a place, and then they look around and we're basically the only game in town if they want to, if they want to explore, the sorts of values that we promote. So I think that does help. But I will say that we have been extraordinarily lucky to have exceptional leadership over the history. It's a 135-year-old congregation. It's had very good stewardship financially and good leadership in terms of everyone. Kate Lovelady, who's our leader there, and has been for more than 10 years now, is an exceptional human being, just like a pinnacle of humanity. She's a lovely person. She knows how to do all this budgeting and everything that I've known about. She is extremely good at her job, and that really, really helps. So I think that it's a combination of location and luck and good leadership. But we're going to be talking afterwards in a workshop about what it means to be a big society and how we grow society. So if you want us to hang around, we can talk about that more. But you did good. I'm very happy to see so many people here. It makes me feel important.
I was reminded in seeing your picture of Black Lives Matter of the Take a Knee protest that's happening, or continues to happen on Twitter. And I just wanted your thoughts about not all social media, but Twitter and what's happening there. Because it used to be a whole different platform for me that I enjoyed, following people that I admire and what they were kind of turning me on to link-wise, and now it's a real unpleasant place most of the time. And I, blame who for most of that. But
Voldemort?
Yes.
Beyond, that's not fair to hold. But the Take a Knee and the Kaepernick site, and I'm not a football fan, I just don't like the game. It has been a huge thing. Both he and his mother I follow religiously. So I was just wondering what your views are on Twitter's role these days in protest.
That's a huge question.
Should we get lunch?
Well, so it certainly was the case in St. Louis and in Ferguson particularly, that the protests that were happening there, both spontaneously immediately after the murder and the more planned protests that came in the weeks and months and years afterwards, because we're still going, that social media, including particularly Twitter, was essential in creating a movement out of that and showing people what was happening. Particularly the ability to show people photo and video of what was happening immediately, and to coordinate in a decentralized way. It's an extremely helpful tool for people to tell people what's going on and where. It is also often a very misleading tool. There's huge amounts of falsehoods and misrepresentations, and including from activists and protesters. You know, everyone is human. Our memories are terrible. We see everything through whatever biases that we have. That's just our evolutionary prerogative. And so there's a huge amount of misinformation that happens. And like many social media platforms which allow anonymity, which encourage extremely quick reactions between people, and in which large numbers of people can respond to one individual person very easily, there is a tendency towards increasing levels of conflict and kind of a mob mentality where people kind of pile on to threads. And that happens to some degree on Facebook as well, and in many social media settings. And that is a problem. I mean, each of these technologies, I did some writing when I was studying for my graduate degree about the ethics of social media and how technologies kind of create different sorts of digital spaces. So it's an interesting question for me. Each of these technologies kind of plays into different aspects of our psychology, and they're successful because they run along some deep grooves in the way that we are as human beings. And Twitter plays into ones that can be very, very powerful for good reasons and very, very powerful for bad reasons. And I think that it's up to the people who provide that service to find ways of trying to tilt it towards the good. And I'm not sure that Twitter has a very good track record of, they're probably based here, aren't they? Is there someone from spies from Twitter in the room? I'm not sure they have a very good track record of being particularly attuned to the way that their product activates the more unpleasant aspects of human psychology. But that is a problem that we're having to deal with all social media. And I don't know, I mean, I don't want to say get off Twitter because it's been extremely valuable, actually essential for the development of a new form of activism. But it clearly has profound limitations. I'm sorry I can't be more definitive than that. How much time? I don't know.
Sorry, can I say something that's not really a question?
It's not. I don't.
Yeah,
I guess so.
So I think because our the way our current president does things, people who are racist or whatever-ist feel more free to just say whatever hateful thing is on their mind and act out that way. So I'm seeing like peaceful protests as a way of not so much changing the mind of people who are so far on the other side, because we've had a book discussion about like moral values, like it is at that level for them. They think that homosexuality and whatnot is actually wrong, and we're not gonna change their mind with our protests, but I'm seeing it as important that we step up and have some kind of counter dialogue and be like, hey, that kind of behavior is not okay.
So yeah, I mean, just to be very brief in response to that, I think you're right about two things. The first thing is, in a class I used to help teach about persuasion at the Kennedy School, it's a great class, one of the things that we taught people to do is be very clear about what your goal is in terms of your persuasive activity. Who are you trying to reach and for what purpose? And we encourage people to kind of segment out potential audiences into, I think, 4 buckets. One was basically people you will not reach with your message. Do not target towards them, doesn't matter, you're never going to reach them. One of them is people who are still going to disagree with you, but might be activated by the opposing side to be active on that issue, or deactivated by you. So you're not going to change their mind, but you might stop them actually voting for it, or stop them standing on a street corner handing out flyers against reproductive rights, or whatever it is. So you can target a message to deactivate a certain segment of the population. Another group is ones who you might move from just agreeing with you to acting on their agreement. And another segment is just people who are already doing stuff who you can get super excited about doing more. And it's really important, I think, liberals and progressives generally are uncomfortable with this, to recognize that not every message needs to be for everyone, and it's perfectly okay to identify an opposing group, right? There are people who actively oppose our values. They have a huge amount of money. They are very well organized. They have for decades been shaping this culture in their image. We have to do exactly what Frederick Douglass says and fight them. They are not going to change their minds because we're nice to them. We have to build power to force them to change their behavior. And that has been the case for every successful movement ever. Now, there may be a slight hiccup in that. So the LGBTQ movement is very unusual in the sense that we have the extraordinary benefit that basically very few minorities, people with disabilities is a minority who has this this kind of structural advantage, if I want to put it in that way as well, in that we are born into anybody's family at random. And so there is a weird seeding of us throughout the population that has enabled us to build relationships with people of any political persuasion whatsoever. And when it's your own kid, right, it makes a significant difference to how you think about those issues. Well, it often does, and there is a lot of good research that shows that the development of those relationships has been very significant in changing people's minds. But not every oppressed group can benefit from that sort of kind of, I don't know exactly how to put it, that spread throughout the population. And so very often you just have to say there are groups of people we do not intend to reach. It is a waste of resources to try and convince the most convinced gun owner to vote for more gun legislation. We have to focus on the people we can win. And we have to be willing to be oppositional about it. Like, there's something inherently oppositional about politics, and that is fine. Sometimes the goal is not to convince everybody to agree with you, it's to win. It's to defeat the people who don't agree with you. And that is just a reality of power. And until we accept that, we are going to lose a lot and complain about losing a lot. Okay.
Well, I'd like to thank James again for